All right, here's your little helpful video on how to do the density labs. So I do have the lab pulled up here, and then the table that you would use. And then I also have the first density gizmo that you'll use as well. So now to fill out the table, you're gonna need mass and volume, because the only way you can get density is by taking mass divided by volume. So first we'll start with object 1, and what we wanna do is find the mass first, and then the volume. So to do that, we would take object 1, which is right here, and I would drag that down, and I would put it on the scale. So you'll see that it gives you a mass. So I would type that in. So I would type 19.5. So I would take this and I would put it in the graduated cylinder, because that's going to give you the change in volume since it has those graduations all the way up. So when you put that in there, you'll notice that we went from 400 milliliters, which was how much water was in there to start, and went up to 414.2. So when we take the volume, it's going to be the displacement, or the amount that the water moved. So if we had 400 milliliters of water originally, that was the volume of water. So the 14.2 that we just added has to come from this object. So we would take 414.2 minus 400, and we'd get 14.2. So that's where we go right here. Now to find the density, you would take 19.5, which is the mass, divided by the volume, and then you'd get density. Now I would go to the nearest tenth, so I would just say like 1.4, okay? And then rank, you need to have more values in order to rank them, so we would have to do another object. So if we went back and put 1 back, and then let's say we do 2, now we got 11.1. Oops. And then I'd want to take object 2 and put it in the cylinder, just like we did with object 1. And this time we only went up by 9.7. So if we took 4.09.7 minus 400, we would get 9.7. And that would be our volume. And then to calculate density, you would divide. And that would give you about 1.1 for density if we went to the nearest 10th spot. Now when you rank them, it has you ranking each object from least dense to most dense. The least dense has the smaller density number. So if we were only looking at objects 1 and 2, object 2 would be less dense than object 1. So if we were only ranking these two objects, object 2 would be the least dense, so it would start with number 1, and then the most dense would be object number 1, because we're looking at just these two. But it will go up to 12 in terms of ranking, because you're going to do all 12 objects. So that's what it means by doing 1 through 12. So I'm just going to get rid of these so it doesn't stay in the document that everybody's using. And that's how you'll do that first part. Now, when you look at these pieces, this has you using the beaker. So instead of using the graduated cylinder, you're going to look at the densities you've calculated for the objects up in the table. And it's going to have you see which objects will float and which ones would sink. So we want to make sure that the liquid density is 1, 0. And this one has a couple more significant figures. We don't have to worry about that. The beaker's already set. So what you're going to do is see whether or not the objects would float or sink. And you can just keep adding objects. So in this case, 1 and 2 are sinking. Object 3 is not. So that's something that you would take note for these. If it's asking which of these objects will float in water, so far only 3. Object 3. So that's what it means to do that. So make sure you use the beaker for that. And then just remember, if something sinks, it's going to have a bigger density, meaning a bigger number value. And then if it floats, it's going to have a smaller value. And then you're just going to compare your density to the table and see if anything looks kind of close. Now for the slice and dice, this one isn't as number based. It's just going to have you use a different gizmo, and it's to focus on the intensive property of matter, which, if you can recall, is the fact, the properties that do not rely on how much you have. So that's what it means to have an intensive property. So use this, see how you do, email me with any questions you have, and then we'll kind of go from there.